Welcome, everybody. Very happy to have Dustin Fife and Abigail Phillips for fostering supportive leadership, creating really more equitable, accessible, and inclusive practices for all. This is the ACRL Leadership Discussion Group. I am Rusty Mahalik from Goldie Beacon College in Wilmington, Delaware, and I want to turn it over to them.
Well, sorry for the short delay. My whole campus kind of the internet shut off for just a moment, and I had a moment of fear trying to get onto my phone to decide if I was going to be able to be here. But I made it back, and Abigail is in the process of traveling between conferences, so we're excited to be with you all today. We'll just jump right in, and I have the slides, Abigail, so let me know if I'm not moving through. We're very open to anyone's questions throughout or at the end in the chat, or we'll give you chances to turn on your cameras or raise your hands or ask questions. We can kind of watch as we go. Our presentation today and our discussion is based upon some research that Abby and I did last year, and we've been working through it and presenting on it the last year or so. We did some qualitative interviews, but first let's let you all know a little more about us. Is everyone able to see my screen? Okay, thank you for the thumbs up. That is a useful tool. So this is us. Oh, I'm going between screens again. Abby, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, hello, I'm in the Portland International Airport coming from Elise. So lots of presentation. Wait, yes, back on track. I was like, does everybody need to know what Elise stands for? ADHD is like all the background information you need. Anyway, Dr. Abigail Lee Phillips, but call me Abby. I worked for 10 years in public libraries and like all the capacities that we do as a volunteer, then a team page and library assistant. Never thought I was going to be a librarian, but directorship directed it, burnt out after a while. So I started a PhD program last year, and now I'm 10 years within academia. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and going to find out about tenure in June, so maybe I'll be associate. And yes, I will look at all your cat pics or share all my cat pics because this is full of Emily pics. Sorry.
Well, thank
you.
you. I'm Dustin Fife. I'm the college librarian at Colorado College, which is a small liberal arts college here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I've been in libraries for 16 years. I also started in public libraries and ended up a public library director. But for the past 8.5 years, I have been a library director or a college librarian at 2 different universities or colleges here in Colorado. I have also had the pleasure of working over the years with people like Abby on research and writing projects that I feel like have brought a lot of value to my leadership career and my leadership practice and experience. It's one of the ways I've learned to ground myself in our profession, and have been really grateful for this particular project over the last year, as it's given me a lot to think about in my own practices and in my own libraries. So we'll just be going back and forth with each other, talking about these different points. Like I said, please ask us any questions you might have. This is kind of the roadmap of what we're going to go through, some of the big ideas. But let's start by telling you a bit about our research project. So we did a qualitative interview project of phenomenology. It was long form in the sense that we spent as much time with the interviewees as they were willing to give us. It wasn't, hey, we need you for 15 or 20 minutes. We talked probably with the longest person for about 2 hours, and with the shortest interview, still almost an hour, about 50 minutes. We did this with 12 people from across the United States, but all of them worked in publicly funded academic libraries. The people volunteered. We reached out through listservs and social media and other places like that to ask for people. And our whole purpose here was to ask them questions about the accommodation seeking process. So we looked for participants who had recently been through the accommodation seeking process at their university or college. From my perspective and Abby's perspective, when, from the process we were building, we had some thoughts to ourselves, but when in doubt, what we were looking for, it was a phenomenology. What we were looking for was the experience, the voices of the interviewees, of the participants. That's what was most important to us as researchers, and helped us find our key points when it comes to discussing leadership. And today, so we know, we are talking about managers and supervisors, but from the perspective of the interviewees, not from the perspective of the managers or supervisors. So we'll just jump into some of our big takeaways once we make sure you all know what our research questions were. Go ahead, Abigail.
You, Dustin. Sorry, Abigail feels very
Sorry, go ahead,
coming
Abby.
from you. No, I was just being. It's been a long conference. So we had two primary research questions. What experiences have the librarians and library workers encountered seeking accommodations in their workplace? And I believe Dustin already said these are seeking formal accommodations.
Yeah.
Because there were some informal, but we'll get into that later. And what can library administrators do to improve the accommodations request experiences of librarians and library workers? And I talked to a couple of my presentations at this past conference. I learned even more about the work that we've done. But so I'm excited to share my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And here are just kind of some of the types of questions we were asking. And don't worry, just stick with us. We're going to get to like what this means for you from a leadership perspective, but like understanding what type of information we got is essential for why we think that our recommendations for you are important. But what offices or positions on your campus handle accommodations? What was your general experience when seeking an accommodation? Who was helpful on campus in your experience? Who was not helpful on campus in your experience? And then this is an important one. We did ask specifically, how did your supervisor or advisors help or hinder you in your accommodation seeking process? Also, how did your colleagues help or hinder you in your accommodation seeking process? We didn't really define terms such as hinder, or we did make it clear we were interested in people who had gone through a formal process on their campus, not just informal processes, though one of the things we did learn is that formal and informal processes are essential to fulfilling a managerial or a supervisory role in these processes. All right. The stories we heard. Go ahead, Abby.
Okay. They were incredibly personal, which I've been reflecting a lot on because I'm a qualitative researcher primarily in ethnography. And so you hear a lot, and particularly with subjects talking about disability and neurodiversity and mental issues and trying to get help, and it's not exactly going the way you assume it's going to go. They've been incredibly personal, and it was also emotional as a researcher, learning to balance that emotional, because it's hard to see somebody cry and know that they went through so much. And very detailed again, qualitative lends itself, which I adore about it. We get to interview people and ask them questions about their lives. And so they gave plenty of, they had everything down, what they remember very clearly, what happened, when, who, and relationship. Yeah, I just, man, we said it on this, on our own slides, not, but and they remembered, but they, unlike me, would not hold a grudge. They didn't seem to hold a grudge or hold on to anger. It just, what happened, and they moved forward. Managers and supervisors played an instrumental role in the experience of interview. Very, very key, whether it was starting off with informal accommodations or assisting them with the formal process or providing any kind of support, or doing the opposite. So we won't bury the lead. Primarily negative experiences. Even when they were successful, they were, we have a term for it later. They were successful. They got the accommodations. That was a lot of work and very lengthy.
Yeah, and when we say like detailed and relational, like I think with this group of people, as you know, you're here to discuss the leadership perspective in these experiences. They remember, you know, what their supervisor said to them on a Tuesday in May of 2022 and why that was, you know, helpful or hurtful. And it's not necessarily to make any individual feel like guilt or shame or anything like that, but it's to say this is an important, anytime someone is coming to you to discuss an accommodation, as Abby said, like that in and of itself is a huge and personal thing to do. So they will remember how people respond to them when they put themselves in that vulnerable situation. And it is an inherently dynamic situation with vulnerabilities and with essential to recognize and understand power dynamics, because the power dynamics are essential in these processes. So, all right. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong screen. I'm sorry. Here are some of the major themes we saw, and then we'll give you some takeaway points that you can continue to discuss amongst yourselves. This is the one that Abby was mentioning, and that we kind of, this is the term we've put for it. When we say it was a lot of work, it did not matter what school they were at, what the outcome was, if their manager was trying to help or was, you know, hindering. Even if everyone was going out of their way to help the individual, seeking an accommodation at one of our institutions seems like a gigantic process burden. There was tons of time, overall time of the process, but also individual time of many small events. There's paperwork, there's appointments, there's interviews with supervisors, interviews with HR. There are fees to fill out paperwork. Every time they would go to their doctor to get another like request from HR filled out, there would be more fees. This process burden was repeatedly described as dehumanizing, that people felt repeatedly from their managers and supervisors, but just from the process, from the campus processes, from the medical institution processes, that they were dehumanized because they had to justify themselves, almost their existence, their needs at every turning point. And this process burden of what we've built for someone to seek an accommodation is monumental. And one of the only key groups that could alleviate some of that burden were supervisors and managers throughout these processes. So that's the term that Abby and I are choosing to use to label it. But there's just, anytime you're seeking accommodation in higher ed, there is a monumental process burden. Anything you'd like to add there, Abby?
Yeah. Yes. I was thinking about this over the conference, and since we've been doing the research, Also, invasive was a word that came up quite frequently, which it was like you had to prove you're disabled to another human, which is when you come from a place, and I'm neurodivergent and disabled, and you, it just takes a lot, as Dustin said, to make that first step and say, I have a certain need to work, to make work function for me, or make this environment function for me. And asking that is incredibly hard. So the idea of this linking, especially if you're not, the point I was making, or the point I was going to, is if you're not doing well mentally, or if you're struggling at the same time trying to balance this, I just can't imagine balancing your physical and mental health while doing all the paperwork and the time and the repeats of renewing the process.
Yeah, that's a really good point to add. You're often this burden is often being added in at already difficult times. Sometimes it's at like a best possible time, like, hey, I'm just starting this job, so I'm starting the accommodation process. I'm not in the middle of something new. But like for some people, when it's an emergent disabling event or something along those lines, we are adding this process burden into their lives when they already are experiencing things that are stressing them. And so it becomes it exacerbates every aspect of their experience. So that's a super important thing to remember. Thank you for bringing that up, Abby. Also, the word invasive. Invasive came up a lot. Like
And yeah.
Yes, and it's a bunch of people that get to ask you really personal questions and decide if what you're saying is important enough that you deserve an accommodation. So like we're not Abby and I aren't legal experts. That's not the side of it that we are discussing. We understand that some of these questions and processes might be necessary. We just want to make sure we highlight that in higher education and in academic libraries in particular, people are experiencing this process as incredibly invasive, overall as dehumanizing, and what we saw throughout the experiences is that leadership, managers, and supervisors are some of the only people that can help alleviate some of that burden and some of that pressure. So the other thing we saw were the collegial dynamics of seeking accommodations. Colleagues played a largely peripheral role, yet impactful, meaning that colleagues who encouraged some of our participants, like, yes, you deserve an accommodation, you can get through this process. Like, they couldn't go and relieve the process burden for them. They could pick up some of their duties when necessary within the context of their work, but when colleagues were seen as supporting them, it was impactful. But it also went the other way, to being passive aggressive to downright aggressive when it comes to like, well, why is this person getting benefit X and I'm not, and things like that. And they're like, we can talk about that question, but there was jealousy, suspicion, isolation, bullying was brought up repeatedly. There was this whole range of experiences from colleagues when it came down to somebody being in the accommodation seeking process. And it's the response from colleagues impacts what people experience. Go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, I did. I was just going to comment on a word you used, but I really, you meant it in another way. But it's not, to me, it's not just that they deserve accommodations, they need. It's fundamentally just as a person who is completely able-bodied, they need this. And often accommodations, particularly invisible accommodation or invisible disabilities, again, we talked a little bit later. Oh, let me try looking at our own slides. The need to explain your disability and prove your disability, which is a horrifying idea that you have to prove you're disabled enough. I believe actually one participant said, "Am I disabled enough? Am I disabled?" It becomes a complicated process, and the jealousy, suspicion, jealousy over getting an office space, or sometimes it became bigger, such as bullying behaviors, which are rampant in the workplace. And it's just such a lonely one. We've heard that over quite often because they were self-advocate. They had to self-advocate. They were doing it all themselves for the most part, unless they had support from their managers and supervisors.
Yeah, that was one of our big takeaways, and we'll talk about that a little more here in a little bit. Our next big takeaway were some of the pain points with managers and HR. Pain points with HR. Oh, the way HR was described across these 12 in-depth interviews was hard to sit through, and I think it's not. One of the things a lot of the participants repeatedly did was not blame individuals in HR, but talk about how those folks in HR were set up to fail because they were under-resourced, trained, represented in the processes and things like that. So there wasn't like a, hey, everyone in HR is a real piece of crap and we need to, like, that was my real problem. But HR was almost always described as understaffed, underfunded, and undertrained, if not outright inimical to the process. HR processes were never described as being clear or accessible themselves, and conversations between supervisors and HR were never described as having been transparent. There was an ongoing theme of the process in which interviewees would talk to the supervisor and they would talk to HR, and then HR and the supervisor would talk without them and then come tell them the decision without any clarity most of the time. And so these were seen as significant pain points. We'll do the next one too, and then I'll see, Abby, if you want to add to either of them. The pain points with managers were connected in the sense that too often managers focused on processes to protect the library rather than support accessibility. That's true of HR as well. They were often seen as not there to run a good process even, or a fair or just process, but to just be compliant and nothing more. And so there's a lot that works there between them. However, with managers, they were one of the only people on campus that can make this process work. And there was this huge, often like the best experiences we got to hear about were when managers worked out informal accommodations while they were working through the processes of the formal accommodation. So understanding this balance between formal and informal and some of those things is really important if you're in that supervisory role. There was always issues when supervisors changed, and that was a big problem. And then there was often described this time of like, once I requested an accommodation, the treatment from my supervisor changed. I was perceived as not working hard enough at that point. I wasn't like, there was a lot of those type of stereotypes that were put on. So those are our starting, there was more, but those, for this shorter presentation, those are our kind of pain points for HR and managers. And I'll turn it back to Abby.
Just had, I told my students this I'll just be blunt. HR is there for the institution, not for the employees, in my view and in my understanding. But maybe a number of you work in HR, and I just so that's where the self-advocacy comes in. And then and reflecting on Dustin's point about like managers, supervisors, HR talking together without you, it goes back to the nothing about us without us within the autistic neurodiverse communities. It's leaving us out is trying to find the best. I was going to find researchy words instead of it just shouldn't be done. You should be part of the process, full stop, because it's about you.
Yeah,
very passionate about it.
I love that saying, nothing about us without us. Like, and that is something to keep coming back to time and again as you think about the processes and the type of clarity and transparency that you want to build in your own career and in your own practices as someone who works in these spaces a lot. So I like that concept a lot too. I will always just keep coming back to the formal versus informal. I've talked about this a lot with people over the last year. As a supervisor, somebody who has been in a library director position most of my career, and at smaller organizations, so there's a little more inherent flexibility in there. I have found and informal accommodations as unfortunately often the way to make things work while we're going through these processes, because these processes can take years. They shouldn't, like a lot of them took about 6 months to 12 months, but they can stretch out, and they require ongoing participation with HR. So the bad thing about make informal things is like they disappear when your manager disappears, and that's a really hard thing for people, and they have to start the process over. But from an individual perspective, if you're thinking about your values, what you want to do as a supervisor, what you want to do as a manager, I have found a huge amount of value with working with people over the years. So just that's one of the things I keep coming back to. Oh, wrong screen again. I'm sorry. All right. Just from the 12 interviews and from, spending time in the literature, these were the recommendations that are just a starting point for us as we talk to supervisors and managers. With the first one, usually like here being the thing I've thought about the most over the last year. Every accommodation seeking process that happens is an opportunity for you as a supervisor or a manager to reflect on the practices of your library and the teams and your colleagues. We heard that over and over, that the accessibility over accommodation, inclusion of people who need accommodations benefit everyone when we use that information to build a more inclusive and accessible workspace. We can think about this like in lots of little examples. We had one of our participants who talked about the fact that every time they would make a change for them, they would just be like, oh no, this change just makes sense for the whole team. So for example, they decided, hey, one of their accommodations was you'll never be asked to teach more than back-to-back classes and more than 3 in a day. And they just like looked at each other and decided, well, nobody should teach more than back-to-back classes, and nobody should teach more than 3 information literacy sessions in a day. And they talked about how they took that accommodation and saw it as an opportunity to think about the library team as a whole. Same thing goes for work from home schedules, that like, hey, sometimes accommodations require flexibility for work from home. Take that as an opportunity, if you are in a leadership position, to think about what the implication is, and not from the perspective that like, hey, if one person gets it, everyone has to get it, because that's fair. That's not why. It's not like a everyone deserves the exact same thing argument. It's that accommodation seeking processes are a moment to open your eyes and open your mind and evaluate your practices, because if you can include everyone, you're more likely to be helping more people than just the person seeking the accommodation. Any thoughts on that, Abby?
remember presented on this area a number of times, of course. When I think about accessibility over accommodations, and when I was at the conference, I also talked about accessibility over accommodations. That is not to say accommodations are not needed or valid, but when as Dustin said, when accommodations for one person actually happens, there's mentors, supervisors, colleagues. I see that makes me question their policies, procedures, the way they've always done things. But I remember a comment from attendees about accommodations are still needed, but accessibility, it just makes it work for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the other big things we saw in there, I've already said this and Abby said it multiple times. People will, if you're helping people through this, people will remember and they perceive whether you are helping or hindering as a supervisor. And it's kind of remembered in that context. That was brought up multiple times across these interviews. And so it's just something to think about. And it isn't to say that like there are processes you're required to follow as well. And it's you know, if you're in a position to look at that from that perspective, it's something to remember. We also saw that vocational awe is very real in our libraries and your library and every library, meaning that there are expectations built up on people to overachieve because you're lucky to work in a field like librarianship, and we have a special role to play. And like when it comes to working with people who need accommodations, vocational awe feels particularly inimical to their experiences. One of the other things was invisible disabilities surround you, and our interviewees believe that they are just, if not more, challenging institutionally. There was quite a bit of discussion about that, and so everyone just needs to accept that they're here, they're around you, they're valid, because sometimes it felt like it was even harder to advocate for them. If you are a supervisor, a director, whatever your position is, it's essential that you know the processes so that it's not just pass someone along like, hey, you need to really call HR. Maybe they do need to call HR, but they also need someone that can help them walk through the process if there is not an advocate on campus who does that type of work. But even having a general idea of what the laws are in your state and federally, and just processes you can use to support your colleagues. And then the last phrase that Abby and I like to use, and I'll let you talk about that one a little bit, but don't let it be an unsuccessful success. So what does that mean to us?
Well, it was successful and the accommodation was achieved in some form or fashion. A number of the participants, it did significant damage to their relationships with their colleagues, with their managers, supervisors, their trust in the institution, trust. Just when you had to go through so much just to get some of the accommodation requests were not very basic requests, and as an employee to see that you have to work that hard and to just get help from your employer, to me that was the unsuccessful part, and more might lead to leaving the job or just kind of quiet quitting, or just. I did want to make a comment about the vocational awe as well, that related to it, that, or maybe you're going to already say this, Dustin, that our interviewees felt that they had to work even more. Like, I think almost everyone was talking about they had to do more to prove that they weren't slacking or they weren't using accommodations to, but they just did even more work than they would they dreamed of, or that's not right. Even more work than what is expected of them, just largely because of that accommodation process and
Yeah.
being vulnerable and sharing.
Yeah, those are all really good. And from my own observations, in throughout my career and what we heard in the interviews, like it feels like someone going through the accommodation process almost forces them to put one foot out, like out the door, just because like they've seen too much of how the sausage is made in their own organization to not be thinking about going to other places and hoping it's better. So that yeah, I think you're right on there, because even with all that vocational law often leads to even more work when you've gone through the accommodation seeking process. So finally, we do have some recommendations just for individuals. One of the things we saw from individuals here is academia is a complicated environment. It's competitive, ableist, excessively demanding. Being vulnerable in this space will likely be emotional, frustrating, and disheartening. We didn't have many interviews that didn't convey the frustration of the processes and the experience, and just how disheartening that can be. Abby's touched on this one a little. HR, one of the things that came across strongly was that HR is not your friend. They exist for the institution. It is partially up to you. I know there are people out there who have had incredible experiences. That is not what we saw in this process. So people often said this same thing too, though. They said your supervisors and your colleagues are not your friends either, which isn't to say that you don't individually have friends at work, but they are not structurally your friends. They can come back and be competing with you for resources, and there can come back with jealousy and bullying and a whole bunch of other things like that. Finally, we talk about what we saw in this process is people are required to advocate for themselves a lot, and you need to know that your needs are valid. The support systems people found inside their colleges usually were from other people who were going through the process, even if they weren't part of the library or had been through the process. And then a lot of people said, and this was hard to hear, that like some honest reflection is necessary. They talked about, is it worth disclosing professionally? There's a huge amount of people, not a huge amount, I mean, several of our people talked about unmasking and how they thought if I could have stayed masked, I would have, or I regretted unmasking, or things like that. So like this is what people are going through, and they have to look at their own identities, their own experiences, their own situation, and decide whether or not they can do that. And that's kind of a sad state of higher ed, instead of a reflection on those individuals. We're starting to have some chats come in, which is great.
Yeah, it's not that I'm masking.
Oh yes, yeah. So
I sometimes do as well.
yeah, some people have let us know that they regret unmasking, and it's a true thing. So with that, I think we just want to turn it over to everyone for questions and any comments you might have. And you were just kind of moving through today. So unless did I skip anything that you wanted to add, Abby?
I could go on for a while. Both of my presentations at the conference were focusing on accessibility, accommodations, inclusivity to their students and employees in higher ed. With invisible disabilities, I have recently heard just a comment from my life. At my hairdresser, her son has ADHD, and she was sharing that with me because I shared my research with her, and apparently her ex-husband said, or because he was struggling, that he just has ADHD, and there's not really a just in having ADHD or autism or OCD or bipolar disorder. I was that broke my heart, but and no, again, I wish there was a research term for breaking your heart, like such as the person, the individual interviewed when they said just they wouldn't do it, they wouldn't recommend it, and again, regretting unmasking, I experienced that myself.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. If you are a supervisor or a manager, if you're a library dean or in a position where you can impact that structure, you should be striving for an organization which people don't regret unmasking in, which feels like a low bar to clear, but like it means structural change and it means cultural change at every level of your team usually. So I hear that again and again, they're regretting unmasking, and I really, really like can put behind it. But it also has to do with all of our intersectional identities. Like one of the things that came up in one of our interviews and looking at my own experience is like, yeah, like honestly, if you're a white dude in libraries and higher education, go for it. Like the accommodation process is probably going to work for you and in your favor. But that doesn't mean you're not valid and not deserving of accommodation. It just means all of those same societal issues get layered over an already fraught process, and just continue to connect. So,
And so at least that's the two main points that really resonate. The institute is protecting itself, yes, and you have to work around that. I struggle with that myself, to have to work around that with my disabilities and chronic illnesses, and just being productive, being resilient, and the process is much worse for people of color, yes, and LGBTQ plus community who are required to justify even more interview with physician. I have a number of friends who are Black women, and they have shared that they went the suspicion that you're mentioning within the workplace and skepticism. And I wonder if some of that is because of the questionable medical research that about. No, I'll think about that on my own.
yeah, it comes back to like those intersecting identities. It is a pain point and an inflection point just because of like of you have to bring your whole self to that process, and so it all gets put through that process burden. At least that's what I've seen. All right, feel free to turn on your mics or raise your hands or ask questions in the chat. We're interested in your thoughts and experiences and whatever you're seeing in your own institutions.
I've been thinking a lot about student disability resource centers because I reached out to get captioning for one of my course videos, and because the student did not have an accommodation to receive captioning, or I haven't heard back from our accessibility resource center. So yes, the minimum required, because it's the base level of meeting the legal, but that's also the informal accommodations I do within my classroom. Is you don't have to have a formal. I don't need a letter from the university telling me to give you extra time, or
For sure. We didn't talk about it today. We are writing about it a bit. It's in there. There was a theme that came out that was kind of like staff accommodation versus student accommodations, and looking at how the college or university responded to one versus the other, and like a feeling in general that like there was a lot better services for students, and so like they clearly know these things are important, so why can't they do it for the people who actually work at colleges and universities? And it's just another point at which to think about our labor, to think about what role libraries play in higher ed, what role this kind of traditional service has, and things like that. So there was a theme along that as well, where with student disability services versus faculty and staff services.
Do you see the anonymous question? Like the type answer live. I don't know what that.
Oh, the
I think I missed it, but much appreciation for this work. But I am curious to know what inspired both you both to do this important research study. I have thought about of it, but haven't heard much about it in academic library lens, even less in public school libraries to be, because I'm curious now about that as a former public librarian. I don't, you want to go, Dustin, or?
Oh, I just think I think what interested both of us was our own experiences, and I'll let you speak to that, but like my own, um, my own experience watching people seek accommodations and help them as a supervisor, and my own experiences questioning whether or not I should unmask, seek accommodation, do things like that. So like I think in general there was just curiosity around it, and knowing that it was an area that needs more voices.
Much of the research I do is because of who the person that I am, and my, again, neurodivergent, disability, chronic illness. They just in my past, my needs. I feel like y'all can hear everybody around it. Hopefully not. Okay, good. Was quite voiceful. I unmasked it took within until after the dog program, but I am glad I did, because I think it's important. It's critical for me to advocate for mental health, mental or disability, to talk about openly about suicide and other issues. And then instead of keeping it in the dark, it's just going to bring more shame and more guilt, and we're not going to move forward. So even I'm trying to doing my tiny little part by being called brave, which I don't think I am, and vulnerable. I will, and so I'm just very open, maybe too open, but that's why I do this research and why we did the study, because I also was very curious about how not like academic librarians or anybody who works at an institution, are they, how do they seek accommodations?
Well, and part of it for me is just like for most of my career, I've been in some sort of library, shockingly, some sort of, or maybe not shockingly, director position. You know, and it just feels like it's part of the job to understand this aspect of what people are experiencing. So that's what really drove me to it, and connecting with Abby on it has been great. Yes, and Elizabeth, the cynical answer. I don't think it's the cynical answer. I think it's true. Like there are some more there are other protections too that cause, like there's Title IX and some things like that that has some more direct guidance for students than necessarily for staff and folks like that. So there are some compliance issues that lead to a more vigorous response, is what I would say as well. Like, so not completely cynical, but like, of course, yeah, they are the source of revenue, and I'm not. I'm supposed to, like, I'm technically, as someone who works in a library, usually seen as a revenue hole and not a revenue creator. So yeah,
I'm supposed to bring in the revenue, apparently, according to our provost, bring in more students.
Yes.
And that was cynical as well, but reality.
No meat, right? Nope. And then 2 Pepsis. One Pepsi. Okay. And a water. Thank you.
Listen, like I just said, but just from talking with other, oh, we're about over, but talking with other people within academia who are neurodivergent or otherwise disabled, chronically ill at the conference I just went to, and hearing their voices. But clearly,
Yeah.
that's us.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for time to
Thank you.
If you want to reach out to either of us, here's contact information from us. We're continuing to do our thing over here, and we'd always love to hear other perspectives.
Thank you both for coming today and sharing your perspectives and your research.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.